Next slide. Next slide, David. Thank you. So, and the next slide after that. Okay, so one of the things that actually started off electronics in this area was in Washington, D.C. There was a place there called National Electric Machine Shops. They were kind of associated with the Navy, and they manufactured things that the Navy thought about. The Navy labs had a lot of ideas, both for ships, for radio, for other forms of communication, for submarines, and they had various other semi-laboratories in the area, but they didn't do much manufacturing at first. So they set up little places like National Electric Machine Shops, and their job was to combine their mechanical skills with their electronic skills and build the actual equipment that the Navy needed built. And then after they had it finally working, that was what the manufacturers like RCA, Western Electric, General Electric, and so on would build to that model. Next slide. That same place, National Electric Machine Shops, had a parallel company called National Electric Supply Company, and often called NESCO. But there were two NESCOs. The other one was up in New England, and it was called the National Electric Signaling Company. And that was the one that actually formed Westinghouse, by and large. And we're going to see that Westinghouse made a full cycle and wound up in this neighborhood after all was said and done. One of the things that NESCO made, the first NESCO, this is National Electric Supply, was a meter here for carrying aboard ship. It's called a wave meter, and it had a number of coils which plugged into the upper right-hand corner of the panel, and that changed the frequency band. And by using this device, they could set the frequencies on all the ships, both transmitters and receivers, which is the only way they kept the ships able to talk to each other. They had to send this around from time to time and kind of standardize the ship as far as frequency is concerned. Next slide. They were located at a corner of 7th and Water Streets, which is now a completely covered area, and it's all full of boutique shops and restaurants and cigar shops and liquor stores and things like that. And it's right on the on the waterfront at 7th Street Northwest, which is kind of strange because there's not much northwest when you get down to Water Street, because you go into the Potomac pretty quick. But that's what NESCO looked like. Next slide. They would take requirements like from NRL, and by building some of the units themselves, they showed NRL how to build their own. And so most of these equipments you see on the left here, which were part of the NRL, a typical workman's bench, were made right at NRL, but they're copies of NESCO equipment by and large. Although they had other companies up in New York that also built the same way NESCO did. In fact, there was one of those for sale out here on the porch yesterday. Next slide. But the biggest of all these labs was a naval research lab. And one day, this fellow, Pat Hyland, and his technician Leo Young were working between a transmitter and a receiver, one on each side of the Anacostia River. And every time a ship went between the two, it changed the signals that the receiver was getting. There was a fluttering condition where the signal fluttered and then it would change in pitch. And they didn't understand what that was, and then they found that it did that with airplanes flying nearby also, because there was an air station there. Anacostia Air Station was already there. So they had discovered radar, and they didn't know it, of course, and there was no such word as radar yet. But at any rate, they took the idea to their boss, Hoyt Taylor. He liked it, but the people above him did not like it. They thought anything that you put on a ship that would make a signal, which would be the transmitter part of the radar, would give away the position of the ship. And that's worse than going along blind. So Leo and Pat got discouraged, and they started building stuff in their home, in Leo's home, in his basement. And they called their work Radio Research, not Radio Research Company or Radio Research Incorporated, just plain Radio Research. They knew nothing about business, but they had a lot of ideas, and they got enough funding because they had applied for a number of patents, and they began selling not the patent itself, but a license to use the patent. And one of the customers was Bendix Aviation. Now, Bendix was in Chicago, but they had a use for some of the ideas that these two guys had. And they began to fund this radio research outfit. Next slide. So everything was going well except for the fact that we were in a depression. And by 1933, they had run completely out of...
We wanted to get you...
Oh, do you want that too? Okay, I'm sorry. So by 1933, they had exhausted their little bit of money, and Bendix wasn't buying too much more. So they did approach Bendix anyhow, and Bendix at that time had bought a bunch of little small companies like this, maybe 4 or 5 of them, and they began to combine them all, and they then formed the Baltimore facility. And I'm not sure exactly where it was located in Baltimore or what it was called, but it had the words Radio Research associated with it, and it was funded primarily by Bendix. And that was by Bendix owning the outfit and also managing the way they were spending money, which Pat and Leo had no idea how to do. So by 1938, another thing happened. The Westinghouse Company, which was the owner of a bunch of radio stations, primarily in Pittsburgh, Boston, Chicago, and in New Jersey, they took their Boston group, or their New England group, I guess it was, and the Pittsburgh group, and they moved them and Radio Research to Baltimore, to the same facility Radio Research was located, except much larger. And this was the start of Westinghouse Baltimore, which became the largest employer in Maryland after a few years. And we were, at this time, getting very close to World War II. One of the things that rolled out of that problem was that they were approached by the U.S. Army Signal Corps, who were having trouble building an actual radar, and they had heard that these two guys had worked with radar many years ago, they had no idea, these Army guys had no idea that these two fellows knew radar, but they knew a very primitive type of radar. The only thing that they'd ever worked with was a couple of transmitters and receivers that detected ships when they wiggled the signal. And but the Signal Corps was having bigger troubles. They were trying to build a big radar to outfit the entire country with these things to detect incoming aircraft, an early warning system. This is back before World War II. Next slide. This was the result of what the Signal Corps was trying to build and was having trouble. They were having mechanical troubles, and they were having electronic troubles. They even had troubles keeping the trucks running. The Signal Corps people were kind of narrow-minded about the whole thing. They really knew telephones best. And so that was the radar they built. It's called an SCR-270. They also had a model of it that was not on trucks, but in a building, and that would be a SCR-271, which is the same radar. Westinghouse built every one of those. They built several hundred of them during World War II, and they had them in every city on the coast of the U.S., every major city around the Panama Canal Zone and in Hawaii. And as a matter of fact, one of these radars detected the Japanese attacking Hawaii. Of course, at the time, management hadn't caught up yet, and management of the defense system in Hawaii kind of laughed off the fact that these fellows thought they saw 200 and some airplanes flying about 200 miles north of Hawaii and headed for Hawaii. And they told them, forget it. And so the guy shut down the radar and went back to camp to get some breakfast. And the rest of that story you know very well. Pearl Harbor got bombed within an hour and a half of that. Next slide. But they built another radar in the Signal Corps and were having really big trouble with it. It's this one, the SCR-268. It had started out before the 270 or the 271 and was much more complex. It required 3 operators, and they rode around on the antenna as it moved on a turntable to change in direction. And as you can see, it's tilted upward, so it also had a rotation upward to reach for different altitudes of where aircraft could be flying. And finally, the third operator, which was the most important guy, was a guy who had to find the range to the target, how far away it was. And he did that, of course, the usual radar method. You time how long it takes to get the transmit signal to the aircraft and see an echo comes back. So that's why we have 3 operators using 3 oscilloscopes, and they rode around whether it rained or snowed or what, it didn't matter. Then we had several hundred of those built as well. Westinghouse was one of the manufacturers, but there were 2 other manufacturers as well, including Western Electric. Next slide. And finally, Westinghouse also built a few of these for the Army Signal Corps. These really do look like radars. They look like modern radars, and they are microwave radars made during the war and used to operate against aircraft and against tanks and against ships. The interesting thing about this radar is that Winston Churchill heard about it, and he heard a lot of raving about it from some of the soldiers that were over there who had been at the Signal Corps where this was tested. And he wanted to see how well one of those worked, so he called Franklin, his buddy, Franklin Roosevelt, and asked him if he could send one of those fancy radars over and let's see if it can find the V2s. Now the V2s are the buzz bombs, which the Germans were shooting at London about 30 or 40 a day, and up to 200 a day some days. So Roosevelt passed a rule down, and so one of these radars, plus a thing called an M8 or M9, I'm not sure exactly, analog computer, plus an anti-aircraft gun, which was a 90 millimeter gun, a very, very long barrel gun, very high altitude capability, and it's made for shooting down aircraft. 90 millimeters is about 3.5 inches. So that's the diameter of the slug that this thing sends, and it explodes. And it had one other little feature, and that little feature was a proximity fuse. That was the very first use of a proximity fuse against enemy aircraft or enemy at all. And this was the very first trial of it. And each of the shells that the anti-aircraft gun would shoot up had a proximity fuse in its nose. And all of those proximity fuses were made at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, right here in Maryland. And score-wise, it was something that Churchill hardly believed. He watched the British guns and American guns shooting at these things when there was no such thing as this radar or the analog computer. And it would take something like 1,100 shots to hit one of these buzz bombs. You have to almost fill the sky full of shrapnel before you can hit one. This thing hit on an average basis at about 1 every 5 shots. And it shot 97% of the buzz bombs that went through its sector. Churchill, of course, was ecstatic, and he ordered those all along the coast of England. And they were photographed by Russian fishing boats and trawlers. They had them in those days too. And so the Russians ordered one, and Roosevelt had it sent to him. And then they duplicated it 2,200 times. And they have them all over Russia, and they're still in operation. And that was in 1943. Next slide. They also made small radars at Westinghouse. All of these previous ones were made at either entirely or in part at Westinghouse. And this is the ASB, and it was a copy of a British radar, except it operated at twice the frequency, almost 3 times the frequency, and was much more accurate. And a total of 26,000 of these were made during the war. Westinghouse making about 95% of them, right here in Baltimore. Next slide. And of course, Westinghouse also built anti-radars. These are several samples of their anti-radar things. These are devices for jamming a radar or for locating it and analyzing what it's doing. Called analysis receivers or intercept receivers, or Joe Koster knows about these quite a bit, because that was his background, was in communications and intercept. Next slide. Then right in the middle of Washington was a national, or in the Delmarva, was a National Bureau of Standards. And there were some employees there who had started a company called RICO, R-I-C-O, Radio Instrument Company. And they made these things on the left, which are transformers, radio transformers. And these particular models you see here snap in place and can be changed very quickly for changing the frequency band for the receiver. And this particular model also uses clips on the back of those stanchions on which the transformers are located. And on the back there are clips for a special MAARC tube, a vacuum tube. So these were very unusual radios. Unusual in 2 or 3 ways. One, they were built at taxpayers' expense at the National Bureau of Standards. And second, they called themselves RICO, or Radio Instrument Company, and they made a profit and they collected a lot of patents on it, which caused a big patent furor eventually, which was solved finally and for all time to come by forcing all employees to sign an agreement when they work for a technical company like this to yield their patents to the company. And if it's, and in the case of the government labs, they have to allow free licensing to the government forever. Next slide. This is another RICO receiver. This was made as a kit, which you build at home. I think it's 4 feet long. It's a very long radio, one of those long superhets, which you see sometimes made by Lutz and others in this country. Next slide. Then, of course, as you go all the way back to that old National Electric Machine Shops outfit, they did a lot of mechanical things like building the housings and things for commercial products, like this vacuum tube voltmeter made by RCA was actually built on a framework made by National Electric Machine Shops. Slide. Next slide. And of course, National Electric Machine Shops couldn't get along too much longer, calling themselves machine shops when they were doing nothing but electronics. So they were joined together with some smaller companies, and they formed a place called National. NIMS Clark. Yeah, that was National Electric Machine Shops joined Clark, and NIMS Clark began turning out intercept receivers and other spooky type receivers, which NSA and CIA and people like that were buying. And that was all during the post-war period, during the Cold War generally. But it was a very, very profitable thing, and it lasted for quite a long time, from sometime in the 50s until sometime in the 80s. That's about 30 years worth of manufacturing very fancy, very expensive receivers. And they made them by the hundreds, and so they are collectible, but not many of us can afford them. I've seen some on eBay for up to $30,000 a piece. Next slide. This is one of them. This is a NIMS Clark, but this was a dead copy that NIMS Clark made from the earlier company, which was CEI, that's Communications Engineering Incorporation, which is one of the small outfits that joined with NIMS Clark. Next slide. And then oh, yes, now we change scenes. I had another slide in there at one time, and I thought I would thin it down a little bit, but I took it out. It showed a second model of those receivers, which was very, very modern looking, but actually did not perform nearly as well as that first one. This is a picture of a radar of an over-the-horizon radar. This is the buildings that, or the containers that hold all of the electronics, and they're all like cattle feeding at a trough, and that's exactly what they are. They're feeding at a central aisle so that it's all weatherproof, because this whole thing is above the Arctic Circle. It's about 71 degrees north, and it's a place called Hall Beach, Canada. It's an extremely bitter place. And there's a huge antenna, which is about 200 feet tall. And when I took this picture, I was only up at the 50-foot level, because that's as high as I wanted to climb. And this was summertime too. In the winter, you couldn't get me near that antenna. But that thing in the distance is one of the dew line stations. So there's a dew line radar system there watching for nearby aircraft. This is one that looks over the pole and looks into Russia and watches the aircraft activity in Russia. This was in 1970. Next slide. A third radar, or a third type of radar, was another over-the-horizon radar. This one called Checkrote, C-H-E-C-K-R-O-T-E, and it was built for one of the other intelligence agencies, and it was on Taiwan. And Taiwan was kind of primitive at the time. This is in 1960s. And we had to bring, our company, ITT Columbia, Maryland, had to bring all the parts over from this country, including the buildings, as broken down structures like Butler buildings. Those 3 tanks in the background are tanks that were to hold diesel fuel, because the building on the left is a diesel plant. Next slide. Oh, first of all, look at the transmitters in that main building. This is a kind of a view looking in a porthole in one of the doors at a transmitter, and you can see 2 iMac 1,000 watt tubes, one on the far left and one on the far lower right. They're kind of at an angle because I sort of stuffed the camera against the window and took a picture. Next slide. Then all of those type structures are in these racks that are completely sealed, and there's air passed through them to cool them. And there were 16 such transmitters that worked at the antenna in Taiwan. And they were all in that building that was on the right that we saw. The diesel plant comes next. So when you build a radar like that, hey, next slide, please. Yeah. When you build a radar like that, you often have to bring power with you. So the same company in Columbia, Maryland, made this building, and they transported Caterpillar generators over there, 8 of them, and you see 4 of them in operation on this side of the building. Next slide. And of course you need fuel, and they could not find tanks on Taiwan of 5,000 gallons, which is what they needed. So they just took out flat pieces of steel and made them. They do all kinds of things like that on Taiwan. It's really an advanced, smart country that isn't afraid to work. And this guy's making such a tank. Next slide. And then they get a whole bunch of guys and roll it into place. And there's 3 of them, as you saw in that first picture. And there's 15,000 gallons of diesel fuel in storage to operate the radar. Next slide. But they also made small things at that same company. They made things called Tinker Toys. This is some of them. I'll pass these around. Joe, do you want to pass these around? I'm sorry, I dropped that on the floor. Those are small combined or integrated circuits. And these ones are all passive circuits, so I would just call these multi-circuits or modules. But they also made them active, which meant they put, in those days, tubes in them. And they marketed some of them through Allied Radio and other places like that. And Motorola heard about them, bought some, and next slide. This is a picture of that same radio, and this is a picture looking in the back of it. And right up here, there's one of the Tinker Toy modules with a tube on it. So they put tube sockets in the Tinker Toy modules. Now, it just so happens that there's an entry in our old equipment contest in the other room using these same Tinker Toys. So you had to take a very close look at them. They were done by ACF Electronics. They were in Alexandria, Virginia, and then moved to Riverdale, Maryland. Next slide. Oh, and this is a radio that uses a whole slew of those things. It was made for the National Bureau of Standards because they were the originator of the Tinker Toy project. And you'll see a radio like that in the old equipment contest as well. Next slide. So we've accounted for a bunch of other little towns around Maryland and one in Virginia. Now we'll look at a bunch of other ones that are different locations. This one turns out to be in Hunt Valley, Maryland, and they make a modern oscilloscope-looking thing, which is actually an analysis receiver for analyzing enemy radar signals. They're made by Microtel, and they're in Hunt Valley, Maryland, which is just a little bit north of here. Next slide. Oh, here's that other CEI intercept receiver I wanted to show you. That got misplaced somehow. And that was when they were located in Silver Spring, Maryland. They then moved to Gaithersburg eventually. So they moved about Maryland, but they stayed in this region. And I think part of the reason, or probably the biggest reason, is their customers were all here. Next slide. So these were some of the uses for those receivers. Then they called them ELINT, SIGINT, and RADINT, meaning electronic intercept, signal intercept, and radar intercept. And the idea was not just to pick up the signal, but to provide the operator with all the tools he needs to analyze it. So he doesn't have to rig a whole laboratory together to figure out what he's looking at with the receiver. Next slide. And when they start to build such a big system like that, they always start off buying these little modules that are very modern. They're still being made. They're being made by the thousands as I speak. Well, not on Friday night, but any other day of the week. And these modules all get wired together, and you buy whatever ones you like to build up the system that you're trying to test. And you do this way because you know these function quite well. Everyone else uses them. And they're reliable, and they're small, and they're actually a large variety of different types and different frequency ranges and so on, power levels, everything. And the idea is you do your prototyping using these, and then you make it small and fit into a cabinet. And that's a tougher job. but you know exactly what has to go together at that point. And these things that you see here are all made in Frederick, Maryland. They're made by an outfit called, what is the name of that place? They just changed their name. I think they call themselves Quantic now, Quantic. Next slide. But here are some of their larger systems. Oh, it's PMI, Planar Monolithics Industries. And these are some of the bigger modules they make. They make small ones and big ones and medium size, so that if you know you need an oscilloscope, you buy an oscilloscope, electronics, and then you match it to a cathode ray tube, and then you have a scope. Next slide. Oh, here's some more of the other companies. Here's Adams Russell. Adams Russell turns out to be in Virginia. This is the Microtel division, I believe. And I see a place called MicroQ. And they're a part of Litton Industries, and they're in College Park, Maryland. Next slide. Here's BDM, which is located in McLean, Virginia. Then there's several in Gaithersburg. There's the first one, which is called Denro. Next slide. Here's one that's up in Frederick. It had been in Rockville for many years, and then moved to Frederick, where there's a lot less rent per acre of land. And this is an outdoor antenna system made out of loop antennas. And they've been making these things for about 20 years now, and are doing quite a good business. Next slide. Here are some more of the companies. These two are in Gaithersburg. Applied Communications, and I can't read what the other one is. You can read it though, because you're looking square at it. Next slide. So it turns out that after the war, World War II, we needed much more condensed, much more complex, and much more capable electronics. And a lot of them were being made in Northern Virginia, especially Arlington, and out near where CIA is on the western end of the Northern Virginia complex. But a lot of that has moved into Maryland for some reason, and no one knows exactly why, except that it has something to do with politics in all likelihood. Next slide. And I just took a look recently to see if this is still the case or if this is all dated stuff. And this is the May 2023 issue of a magazine called JED, which is the official voice of the Association of Old Crows. Well, the Old Crows are a group of 65,000 people working, or past working, they're probably veterans of the Cold War and all of the electronics that had to be developed during the Cold War. And they continue to get together every year, and they do a lot of advising of the Department of Defense. The foreign branches of this, of course, are kept separate as far as their ideas are concerned. So they have their own little security system. It's almost as good as the CIA. Well, it's probably better than that. So one of the things I did is I looked at this magazine issue, the May 2023 issue, and they had in there a list of, I think, 9 pages of describing 50 different models of these fancy receivers that are currently being built throughout the world. 20 of the 50 models were made in the US, and 8 of those were made in the Delmarva. by 6 different organizations. So we are a significant part of the intelligence receiver and intelligence electronics sector of the Department of Defense, or of the intelligence departments. Next slide. And finally, I had to throw in a slide from Bendix Radio up in Towson, Maryland, just for the guys who are really into radios and don't give a damn about these transistorized things. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll take questions. Anybody got? Microphone. Would anybody want questions?
Microphone. Oh, right there. Don't Scott.
Any questions, anybody? No? Oh, there's one.
Yeah. Wait.
Okay, thank you. Ed, you talked about 2 NESCOs, one of them in Massachusetts. Was that one the Reginald Fessenden NESCO?
Well, you're talking about HUMINT, actually.
No, very early in your talk, you mentioned there were 2 NESCOs.
Oh,
One in Massachusetts and the National Electric Supply Company in Washington, D.C. Was the one in Massachusetts the Reginald Fessenden NESCO?
oh, let's see, who was in Massachusetts? That was where Fessenden got his start, and he formed a company, which they also called NESCO, and he was an advisor, which later turned out to be beneficial to the Navy, but a big thorn in the Navy side. He was an interesting guy. You should read the history of Fessenden. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you.
I appreciated all those photos you took of the radar installations, but I'm wondering if they were secure installations and you were taking pictures, why didn't you get arrested?
Yeah, probably.
You caught me.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. See, I told you he knows a lot of stuff. He could speak like that for days. 2 important things that we have yet to do tonight. One concerns someone in the club who's very dear to all of us. Brian Belanger and his wife Diane are celebrating their 61st anniversary today. So would you stand up, please? Stand up. Brian has long been one of the most important people in our club. He's one of the editors of Radio Age. He's our #1 auctioneer. And we love you both, and 61 more to you. So another important person in our club for a long time is Jeff Shear, and especially important today is that he's the manager of the Old Equipment Contest. So I'll turn it over to him.
It looks plastic to me. I was sorely disappointed in the category 1 that we didn't see one of those Bendix radios that he put up there. Okay, and I know some of you have those. Where's Rod? Yeah, he's hiding in the back. But actually, it went quite well. I was pleased with the turnout, especially in, I I got to get my glasses out so I can read this thing. I should have prepared for it. So the thing I appreciated the most was in the first category. Category number 3 didn't have anything in it. The category 2 was represented as well. The thing that was most encouraging was category 4. Category 4, okay, with the pink radios, and that would have been something that really would have impressed Paul Farmer if he was still here. We had 6 entries in the pink and salmon radios. So thank you, everybody. And also thank you for all that contributed, okay, and put items into, you know, the old equipment contest. It wouldn't be anything unless you did it. And hopefully some of you will be inspired to, you know, to give back as well. So let me get started here in theme 1 with the vintage Mid-Atlantic Electronics. Gary Alley took first place with his Jones radio display. He had 3 pieces of equipment there, and it was very well presented. The Rico radio came in second, and then Steve Hansman's Jones, get this right, Concertine was third. Category 2 was the military and intelligence radios, and that went to Charles Richardson, home built. Okay, the home built multi-band, and this thing is not working properly. Dave Rossetti, 1 second on that with the torpedo sonar detectors. I don't know the rest of this, and I'm going to turn this back to you. You can have it on. If you can't hear me in the back, okay, Diane, just raise your hand, okay? All right. So in the analyzer, that's category theme 3. That didn't work. We didn't have any entries in that. But in the pink salmon radio category, Rod Masco with his Zenith and Silvertone radios, and the nice work he did on that won first prize. Eric Stenberg with his Storm Carlson P4 was second, and then Gerhard Grieg with his Astor. I kind of like that radio. Gerhard didn't hear it. That was nice. He won third. In the category 5, we only had 2 entries. Roy and Joanna with their GE radio won the blue ribbon, and I came in with the Scott, the Renlo Scott phonograph, radio phonograph. Foreign radios, Gary Alley with his Volkswagen VP301 won first place, and Steve Hansman with his Consort 375 was second, and the Sonora S5, that one with the book was sitting in front of it, was in third place. Novelty radios, that was the man from Mars hat, Eric Stenberg, that was first. Eric Stenberg with the Melody Cruisers, and then Rod Masco with his Caribbean Cruiser. Thank you for those. Under portable TVs, we had 3 entries there. Rod Masco with his handheld TVs. That was quite a display. And they worked. I mean, he was actually plugging them in and came running in after we had already started the judging. He said, well, I wanted them playing when they came in. But fantastic. Okay, so he didn't really need to wow anybody with his display. It did it on its own. He didn't have to produce anything. I'm going to let him go before we break up here so he can turn it on and you can see it. The second place on that was Wyatt Circa with the Pilot TV. How many of you saw it actually working? Okay. He had it on all day, and it was a nice hand warmer. The only problem was it was a hand burner by the end of the day. So I shut it off about 5 minutes before he came back after he had gone home. So, and then the last place was the Singer TV and assorted display there. On number 9, the audio equipment, that was Gary Alley with his, I'm going to get this wrong if he's out there, Nagra 3 and Slow Sync or something or other. Okay, and he won the first place with that. And we only had 2 entries. The only other thing was the realistic combo display that I threw in there to make sure it took up space on the table. All right. So that's exactly what we did. You know, just put it out there, take up some space, you know, make it interesting. And anybody can do that. assuming that, okay? How many of you don't read it? I thought so. I knew there wouldn't be any hands. Okay. And that was the RICO 1. And that was pretty well displayed, not only in the September issue of the regulation, but Ed touched on it a little bit today in his talk. On salary producers, we only had 2 entries. Steve Hansman, who was 1932 RCA microphone, took first, and the town crier speaker took second. Number 13 was the recording equipment, and that went to John Hall. Hallelujah, John, way to go, baby. You know, he puts things in every year, all right? And it doesn't have to be fantastic, it doesn't have to be pretty, but he does it. And this year he took his first place with the Mohawk Digitape number 500. Second place was Gary Alley, and it was kind of interesting because he had Mohawk as well, but he had mid-state recorders. And then the Panasonic boombox, that was another, put it on the table, take up space. So at least we had 3 entries there. Tombstone and Cathedral Radios, Roy and Joanna, one with their RCA Tombstone. The Detroit 5 came in second, and Eric Stenberg with his Western Air Patrol 40 was in third. On the open category, Gary Alley again, okay, I know you're getting tired of her name. Chesco, he had a Chesco in there, and John Hall with his Phelps radio. And that was that real, you know, you'll have to ask Ed Lyon what that thing is made of, because he's explained it to me twice, but I'm getting old and I don't understand it. So, but I know it's a form of bakelite, but it's not. And evidently you had to hand, you know, had to have a hand bevel it and all that. And then in third place was David Willenborg with his green CR-18. Best in show, Gary Alley. Okay, and that was in category 1, which was, you know, the radios in this area. And he had the Jones radio display. It was really a nice, beautiful display. And then for the best preservation award was in category 10, which was the Lazarus, was on that Trident 10. And then on historical merit, there were 2, Gerhard Greed, okay, with the Tinker Toy Project. Okay, that really looked, it was really cool. And then the RICO 1 also got the historic merit because of, you know, being historical itself. Okay, and then, okay, so that's the end of that. Do we have any more? Do you have anything else? Yes. You do? Yes. Is it important to ride? Can you go or? You can ride, you can go. Go ride, you can go turn it on. Okay. Is that what? Oh, yes. People's choice. Okay, now you've already filled out your ticket, okay, only 1 ticket for laundry. All right, so, but please go in there and make, that's the last one that we need to award, and I've got to count ballots, okay? And then we'll present it prior to the auction tomorrow. All right, so please, you know, put your ballot in. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have a round of applause for everybody in that contest. And thank you, Jeff, again for the organizing of it. You do. So I want to thank the board members. Give me that. And I want to thank all the people who've helped me organize this stuff. Dave Rossetti, Eric, Joanna. There's too many to name, and I can't remember right now, but thank you very much. So,
I forgot to mention the judges. I'm sorry. Give them a round of applause. Dave, Harris, Ed Lyon, and our newlywed back there.
So rumor has it that there is more dessert left. I'll make sure some gets set out for those of you who would like a little more. And for those who are full, you can walk it off by going into the old equipment contest, voting for the People's Choice. If you have an item in the contest, please remove it tonight so the space is available for auction consignment. And that's all she wrote, so thank you all for coming, and we'll see you. We'll be open again for registration tomorrow at 7. Ed's presentation is, what time? Your present? It's on the schedule. All right. 9:30, that's Ed's Radio Repair Clinic. And the auction consignment will close at 11:30. The auction will start at 12 o'clock. There's going to be some really neat things in the auction, and I may buy one of them. So thank you all for coming. We'll see you tomorrow.